Alright, next step here is to actually mark the side dot. I'm going to take my saddle square, go into the middle, draw a line on the fretboard, come back with my ruler and mark about an 1/8 of the inch down, and that's where my side dot will go. So I think I actually want a little bit more than an 1/8. Let me see what the fender neck looks like. So here's the fender neck. It looks it's like about at an 1/8, so we'll leave it at an 1/8. So I'll just go through and I'll mark each fret here. On the 12th fret, they actually mark on the outsides versus the center, so I'm going to draw those lines. So I've got my drill press all set up. I've got a board to rest this on. I'm going to be using an 1/8 inch bit. It's a brad point bit. Just going to go ahead and drill. Alright, next thing we're going to do here is we're actually going to fret the neck. What I've got is some basic tools here. I've got a fret press, some end nippers, the frets, a fret saw to clean up anything that is kind of left over, a fret bender, and then a beveler with a 90-degree to get the frets flat. So what I'm going to do is go fret by fret here, glue them in, press them down, clamp it, let it sit overnight. Alright, first things first, I'm making a fretboard. You gotta take the frets and bend them. So what I like to do is take the first fret, bend it so it fits under my fret bender, and then take it and roll it around. This takes a couple minutes to do, but then you've got all the frets bent. I like to bend it slightly more than the radius of the fretboard. That way it's got a little bit of a spring into it and it locks in. Once we bend, I like to go back and cut off the ends so I make sure I don't use them. Now I've got my bent fret, so what I'll do is I'll go back and cut these to fit each slot like this. Alright, next after I get them all cut, you can see I've already started. I use a backing board on my fret press. That way I can balance this out and I've always got it level. What you always want to do is take your fret saw before you fret and clean out the channel. Make sure it's at the right depth and make sure there's nothing in there. All the sawdust is cleaned out. That way you've got a nice clean channel. What I do is I take my fret, I take a little bit of glue, and I just bead the glue in and make sure it's smoothed across the fret. I've always glued my frets in. It's kind of just the way I was taught. So get up to the board, up to the jig, get everything lined up. Just press it in. Get a wet rag and clean off the glue. That's fret 1, and we'll just keep going down the line. Get the fret, some glue. You just want a little bit of a bead. A little bit on both sides. Give it one good press. You don't want to over press, you just want to make sure it's snug in the channel. And just keep going down the line. What I like to do after I've done, about 8 to 10 frets is I like to stop and glue them and let them sit for a couple hours. That way there's no movement. So I usually just let this sit for about 4 or 5 hours. Make sure the frets are nice and seated properly, that there's going to be no movement when the glue dries. That way I've got the frets perfect, and the better you do the frets, the less fret leveling you have to do, which makes your life easier later. Next up is to take the end nippers and cut these off. Be really careful that you don't twist these so you don't move the fret. And these end nippers I ground myself on my grinder. I didn't buy the StewMac ones. You can actually make these yourself. You don't want to take this to a sander or a bandsaw because you don't want to heat up the fret. If you heat up the fret, you may actually move it. Next up is to take the fret beveler and start on the 90-degree side here. Find your edge and go back and forth till it's level. Alright, next step here is to take the 35-degree side and go back and forth till you get the ends of the fret flush with the neck. Alright, next step here is to actually level the frets. The frets are already pretty level, but there's always high spots just depending on how the fret gets seated. So what I like to do is take a marker and draw right on the top of the fret to see how much more I have to do. That way I know everything's level. So this is an old Luthier trick. Now I take my sanding beam here. This is the StewMac 7.25 radius beam. And I'll just take this and go back and forth. And you want to kind of follow a pattern where you start here at the bottom and kind of move yourself back up. And you just take light strokes. This is 320 sandpaper. You don't want to do anything more aggressive than this. And you're just going to go back and forth and level. So now I'll go back and see where I've got some low spots. And I got a couple low spots here and one here. So I'll just go over those here. I'm looking pretty good. So I'll go back and vacuum this up, then begin to do each individual fret. So when you're fretting, you can buy a ton of different fretting tools from StewMac. You got the triangle, you got different crowning tools. My favorite tools are these diamond grinders, and then this to get the edges right. And so before I do any more work, I'm actually going to tape off the fretboard, make sure it's protected. You know, it cleans up pretty nice after that first, but as you get into the fret, you really want to make sure it's protected so you're not scratching the board. So with recrowning, I'm going to take this 300 grit recrowner, and I'm just going to go back and forth, move it slightly side to side. And essentially what you're doing is, if let's say this is the fret before you crown it, this is what happens when you crown it. And essentially what this tool does is it's got a slightly larger, and it does is it goes back and forth and it recrowns that top of the fret. So as you're doing this, you want to make sure that you don't over grind, because then you'll take the fret down too far. So you just go back and forth, and you can see it as you're doing it. The fret kind of just turns, I don't know, you see the sanding lines here, and what happens is you just kind of grind them off. So you just go fret to fret here, and recrown them is what that's called. Here's the 3rd fret. You just keep going down the fretboard here. So then the next step is I take this sanding beam. It's got 220 grit on it. And I go back and forth and I start to take out the scratches from the grinding. What's great about this tool is you can just kind of move it back and forth. And you take out the scratches, you kind of get the fret to look a lot prettier. And it starts to become, the fret actually becomes hazy. So you just go back and forth and clean up the fret. And we'll do the same thing at the 2nd fret. Alright, next step here is to take some 600 grit sandpaper and begin to almost polish it. So I just go over the fret back and forth, and again it becomes hazier, and I hold it on an angle, and again this is just kind of like crowning it slightly, but it's definitely polishing out the scratches from the 320 that I was using on that stick. So you just keep going down the fretboard here. And what I do is I just keep folding this piece of sandpaper up and hold it on its edge and get all those scratches out. This is why you gotta mask off the fretboard, because now this gets really dirty. Next up, we take some 1200 grit sandpaper and go over the fret and get any more scratches out that you can. So this is definitely polishing up the fret. Really not doing any removal of anything here, but you can see pulling the scratches out pretty good. Don't be afraid to push to get those scratches out. Next step then is to take steel wool and go over the fret and polish it up some more. This actually goes pretty quick. Essentially just take your finger, plant it over the fret, and just polish it up. Next we're going to take the green buff from Stu Mac, the fret buffing, and go back and forth here at a slow speed. Next then we take the white buff, which is the fine buff, and get it up to about 6,000 RPMs and go do the same thing. You go back and forth on the fretboard. Alright, next thing here is to make the nut. Now I've got a 1/8 thick blank, and I've got a pencil that actually has been ground down. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to size this up. This pencil's got a flat edge, so I know exactly where to cut and sand. And then an old trick is to take the pencil over the frets and go back and forth. You'll know exactly where the bottom is. So here I want to cut slightly above that line there. Next up is you can take your handy Stuart McDonald's spring spacing ruler, or if you don't have that, just find an old neck and line up the nut. And here I've already got this set up. You're going to find the center of the board and just line it up. Before I actually cut the fret, I'm going to glue it in here, that way it's nice and solid. As I take the file back and forth, it's not going to move. Get a dab of glue. Extra fret here. Just smooth it out. Definitely a little bit too much glue. What I'll do is I'll push this in. We'll just let this sit overnight, so that way when I actually cut the nut, it doesn't move. Alright, so the next step in fretting, after this has been glued in, is you want to take 2 pieces of tape, put it on your pencil, and this will help draw approximately to where you're going to cut. So I learned this trick from another YouTuber. And you want to cut just slightly above that line. You're going to need the StewMac nut cutting files, and these files are expensive, and I haven't found any replacement for these. So, you know, essentially you want to grab a set of strings that you use pretty frequently. I like using the Santana heavy strings. I'm just going to go through and cut this. And so with the E string, you know, it's a 0.56, so I'm going to use the 0.6 side here and just cut down. And you just go slow. And cut. You know, stop every couple seconds and see how deep you are. I'm just slightly above the line, so I'm going to leave it. I always go back and re-cut the nut once the guitar is set up. So these are just approximate cuts, and once I get everything set up to my liking, I'll go back and recut it. So for the 5th string, this is a 0.38, so I'm going to take the 0.42 side here and go and cut this one. One thing you want to do every once in a while is just go back slightly on an angle. Next size is going to be 0.28, so I'm going to use the 0.32 side here on the D string. And just go back and forth and check. The G string here is 0.019, I think. So a little bit thicker, so I'll use the 0.26 side here. And then the last cut is with a 16 and a 12. Alright, next step here, after I've got the nut cut, is to take a little bit of a little file and just round off the edges. Make sure it's flush with the piece of wood. you don't got any sharp edges on it. You can always take a larger sander and just smooth out the nut a little bit. You don't want to do it on this side because this is where you want it a hard cut. But on the top and on this back side, you want to get rid of any edges. Alright, last step before I carve the neck is to take this 1/8 inch walnut dowel plug, glue it into each one of these spots, and sand it off. So I only need a little bit of glue. I'm just gonna dab a little piece in here with my nail. Take the dowel rod, punch it in. Take a flush cut saw and just cut it off. And again, I'm going to go from multiple sides here so I don't get any tear outs. And we'll go on to the last spot here. So that's how you do the inlay dots on the side. In the next video, I'm going to carve the neck, sand it, and finish it.